because they don't understand what communication is for. So some may develop a quite extensive language before they know how to use it, before they understand what the language is for. And we need to teach them. And then emotional consciousness. Of course people with autism have emotions. A big rich array of emotions. They often feel them very deeply, very strongly. It affects their behaviour, just as it does a baby. You don't ask a baby how they're feeling, though, do you? You want to know how a baby's feeling, you watch what they do. Because we know when you're a baby, in fact until you're about 3, the amygdala doesn't connect the emotion areas of the brain with the cognitive areas. So you don't have that conscious awareness. So you have an emotion and it comes right out in behaviour. Many people with autism still experience that, right through to adulthood. Jim Sinclair said, an able person with autism from the States, people spend years trying to get me to control my emotions, trying to get me to recognise them in other people. If only they told me what they were. I didn't know what they were talking about. Until they make that connection, you don't know. We have to help them get in touch with their own emotions first. Because if you don't know about emotions, what sense are you going to make of, this is a happy face, this is a sad face? It's not, is it? That's fine if you already know about emotions, then you can have symbols. You can say this is a happy face, and a sad face. But it's not real. Imagine if you didn't know about emotions and you're trying to make sense of them. And you go out in the world and you look for people who are going like this. You wouldn't find many, and if you did, they probably wouldn't be happy, they'd probably be demented. It's not a natural expression. You don't behave like that. People with autism struggle enough to understand our world. Why do we tell them lies? Why do we make it easy just because it's easy to teach? It makes it harder to learn what's real. So above all, we have to be authentic. We have to be real in autism. I always say people with autism have inbuilt bullshit detectors. Excuse my language. But they actually are pretty good at sussing out whether people are being honest with them, telling them something that's true and matters. And I think we need to respect that. Now, diagnosis, we've had a bit about it yesterday. It's important, I think it's important, the reason I'm going to give. And it's not a good basis for services. There is no diagnosis, however broad or however narrow, that predicts or says what kind of education somebody should have. We can make some generalisations, but in the end, we have to go back to the individual. But the difference in autism is that we can't just go and look at individuals and assess their needs. Because in autism, how we interpret those needs is going to depend on that autism lens that we look at the behaviour through. We need to know about autism in order to think, hang on, my usual, my natural interpretation of this behaviour may not be right. It may be different because this comes from autism. So we look, of course we look, we observe, but we observe with that knowledge, that frame, so we can reinterpret what we see. And we've got to remember that autism isn't really something you can have by yourself. Our language speaks as if the person has autism and the rest of us don't, and that's okay, that's nice and clear. But it's not actually how it is. Because autism is an issue about interaction. Now, can you have autism on a desert island? Who would know? It takes two to have autism. One to have it and one to notice. It's what happens in that interaction where the autism is. So whenever we're talking about educating, managing behaviour, all those awful phrases we have, we need to think about our role in it as well as the child's. Not about apportioning blame or responsibility for actions, it's about trying to build that understanding. Now, people with autism are often, or it's said about people with autism, that they lack empathy. Absolutely, that's one of the myths of autism. They don't lack empathy. In fact, some of the people with autism I know are the most empathetic people I know. But especially when they're young, they lack understanding of other people. And I suggest to you that we too lack understanding of people with autism. Because we're programmed to understand one another if we haven't got autism. We're programmed to understand the typical. So we find it relatively easy, especially if we come from a fairly common culture, to understand one another, to develop empathy for one another. But when we're faced with someone from a very different culture, even more so someone with autism, where we struggle to know what they are thinking, what they are feeling, how they are making sense of the world, then we too find it hard to be empathetic. Not because we're nasty people, not because we don't want to, of course we do. But there's a breakdown. We don't do it naturally. We too have to work at it at the cognitive level, just as people with autism do. They have to work it out because they haven't got an intuitive way of understanding us. And I suggest to you that we don't have an intuitive way of understanding them. We too have to work it out. So when we're together, we have a mutual problem. We have to help them understand more. We too have to try and understand more about the world that they inhabit. So the role of education is particularly vital in autism, more so than in any other special need. Of course, they're human beings, so they have an entitlement. They're right. Knowledge, skills, understanding that their culture values. That's their right. They're going to participate in that culture, and they must have these things. We also know that having academic learning can lead to more success as an adult. Not guarantee a success, but it certainly contributes. If you've got a marketable skill, something by which you can earn your living. Point of that access has got to be real access, not tokenism, not a child sitting isolated in a corner of a classroom, especially not with a support worker by their side. They look good, but I'm afraid many support workers interpret their role because they're nice, good people, but they may not have a lot of training in autism. And they may interpret their role as if schools were like factories. As if the purpose of being there was to get through the curriculum, get the product done. So if the child is struggling, the support worker may take over more and more. That's not the purpose of schools. Some of our governments think it is, but it's not. The purpose is to help people develop to become as good as they can be, not to get some product finished. And the danger is, I met a mother the other day who I'd known when her child was at school. And she had fought very hard for him to be mainstream and to have his own support work. But she was nervous, she felt he wouldn't cope with the school environment unless he had that security. So all his school life he had had someone sitting with him, supporting him. Now, at the age of 22, he won't do anything until he's prompted. He won't pick up his knife and fork to start his meal. He won't do anything without a prompt. He has become completely prompt dependent. So we need to think what we're doing. You may need to start a child off with that level of support, but you've got to make sure it's real support for learning, not for getting through the curriculum. And we've got to think about how we use that and how we help them manage more on their own with aid. So when do we start? Well, as early as possible. Parents need to start the educative process. Parents haven't any choice but to interact with their child. So it's not a burden on them to help them do it in the most effective way. That's what we need to do. Not that any professional out there knows all the answers. They don't know exactly how parents should behave. But we can help them understand their child more. The more they understand their child, the more likely they are to be effective as educators for that child. So it's very important that we involve parents and as early as we can. And then Ali is here to talk for herself, so I don't need to say, but very impressed with one of the things that she wrote about how many children, working with children for a long time, very early ages, and just how much better they are now doing. And she made the case that they're not a different group of children, but they are, when we get there early and we do the right kind of things, we do see big advances. I was particularly talking about language development, how it used to be quite an issue in autism, still is for some people, but how we are getting better at teaching it. And then the Denver model, which has that multimodal approach, search, which develops social, there are lots of techniques now out there. Even behaviourism, even ABA. If you look at the Young Autism Project, Lovis's famous claim to education of kind. If we look at, if we take it on face value that it was quite successful for a group of children, I think people missed one of the key things that Lovas did. People focused on the discrete trials, the methodology of what he did. But one of the clever things that Lovas did was that he selected children who were near a nursery school that would accept them. And as early as possible, those children were entered into that nursery school. And what he did was to concentrate in the one-to-one sessions on teaching skills that would enable them to be part of that nursery school, that would help them participate. And also getting rid of behaviours that might be a barrier. And that's such a sensible thing to do, isn't it? To look at an environment you want a child to function in and to think, how can I support that? How can I build the learning that will enable them to function in that environment? That important aspect of what he did has been rather lost. But although it's important to start early, it's never too late to make a difference. I've seen adults transformed. My friend Ross will be speaking next. Even in how long have we known each other? 20 years? Even in those 20 years, her growth and the amount she's learned and how she's developed has just changed so dramatically. I think I would find it hard to recognise that gauche girl who approached me so many years ago. People change, and sometimes, when they're young, they're at school, actually a lot of the years are wasted because there's so much going on in their lives they find it hard to concentrate. Sometimes the biggest growth in their development is after school. The saddest thing in many countries, including the UK, is that it's very hard to access education once you've left the school system. So there are a few things, but there's never enough. We do need to continue an educational approach to adult services, I think. But if we can get children with autism to actually engage with other children, typical children, then that's a big step forward. Because automatically then, they are beginning to develop their social skills, they're developing their communication, and they're actually becoming more flexible. Because it's other people that make us flexible. I live on my own, and to be honest, I'm pretty rigid. I don't like people messing about with my things any more than most people with autism do. Okay, my office is a mess. I have what's called the volcano system of office management. which works very well if no one interferes with it. You know, I know roughly at which level the bit of paper arrived, and I can extract it. But of course, if I have my grandchildren over and they're rummaging through to look for a bit of paper, then it's not so good. Now, I can adjust, because I love my grandchildren, and on the whole, it's worth putting up with that, to see that. Many people with autism don't see the point of other people, especially other children, or teachers. What are they for? Parents, you can understand, they get you things, but but teachers, what do? They stand next to you and make it hard for you to concentrate and do things. They talk at you all the time so you can't get on with what you're doing. They really often don't see the point. So one of the focuses of early education has to be to try and make other people more attractive. Try to find things they can do together which they both enjoy. And that should be a big focus. When we're looking at researching the outcome of our efforts, then there are a lot of confounders. Obviously, how bright the child is going to affect their ability to learn, especially in autism, because they have to do so much more cognitively. Because the social brain isn't operating at the same way as in other people, then they have to use general cognitive structures to deal with social information. That's why if you want them to learn something new, you're best to do it in an asocial way. The computer, or through an organised structured teaching, like in the TEACH programme, things that make it very clear what to do, so you don't have to have it through somebody telling you and so on. The reverse of that is if you want them to be sociable, then you have to find something they can already do, so that they can concentrate on being sociable. What they can't do is be sociable and learn something new. So we need to think, be sociable, to learn to work in a group is important, but you can only have one thing at a time. Do I want them to learn a new thing, and I make an environment so they can do it? Do I want them to learn to be with other people and to work with other people? And that's a separate issue. Find something they can already do, might be new to the other children. The person with autism can do it, so now we can concentrate on how to do it with other people, which for him or her is going to be a much more task. We need to build activities, especially for adults. There was a book many, many years ago. It wasn't particularly about autism, though included many people with autism, looking around the hospital settings in which many of these people were then living. And it was called The Wasted Hours. And sad to say, I see many adult establishments when I too want to say the wasted hours. I don't know what your toleration for being bored is, but mine's pretty low. I've really struggled when I'm bored. And yet I can think about things, I can remember things, I can recall things at will, I can, I have many strategies. Imagine now I have autism and I'm bored and I have nothing to do. How hard that is. How the days drag. And yet so many adult establishments I see, that's the situation. There's a father here, I don't know if he's in the audience, but he's certainly at the conference, who once wrote to me describing his son for whom he'd fought for special education and then had fought to establish an adult service. And he wrote me one of the saddest letters I've received, saying, did they struggle all these years just for his son to end up in a benign prison? That's how he felt about an institution which was supposed to be a model of its kind. And we have too many of that, so we must really think about where we're heading with the education and the care of people.
Rita, this is your 10-minute warning. 10 minutes left.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Right, okay. Worse than ever. Right. So, well, I've talked about most of that, haven't I? And I've mentioned that, communication, and teaching social skills. Very hard to teach social skills as a set of rules. Someone pointed that out at a meeting I was at yesterday. Social skills arise in context. The idea of taking someone out of that context and then teaching them a rule is kind of crazy. You know, it's like people who watch lots of cookery programs on television but never cook. Because the translation of that into actual activity is quite hard for us. We might do it if we were cooking at the same time as we were watching the demonstration, but, you know, remembering it and recording it and translating it into our own actions is different. It's the same with people with autism. You know, we need to learn social skills in the context in which they occur. And of course, the awful thing about social skills is that they're so adaptable to that context. Just the thing that people with autism find hard to do. They can learn a rule, but that rule may not apply, may not be appropriate. The trouble with many social stories is that it can give somebody a veneer of being able to manage. Now, I like social stories, they have a role to play, but we must be cautious. There are no panaceas. And if we teach someone a social situation as if it was a little play scenario, then they act it out and it may not be appropriate. But because they may know the right words, because they may know a way of acting, that may give the people around them the idea that they know more than they do, that they're more competent than they do. And so the person may get further and further into trouble because they don't know how to get out of those situations. We haven't given them that understanding. So whenever we teach a social skill, we have to teach them how to get into social situations, but also how to get out, to escape, and how to indicate. You know, the biggest thing we need to teach from children right through to adults is how to ask for help. People with autism often naturally go to a non-social source, which may be very effective. I once picked up a hire car with Ros, and it was rainy, it was dark, we were at an airport, we were late for a conference that I was supposed to be talking at that evening. The plane had been very delayed, and I couldn't work out how to get into reverse in the car park. I was desperate, couldn't, you know, I thought, well, maybe I could drive around and never go into reverse, so I tried that, but I got further in trouble. Now, my strategy was then to get out of the car, even though it was pouring with rain, and try and find somebody I could ask. Ros, meanwhile, just got the manual out and looked through and found what to do. I didn't find anyone to ask. So her strategy was much more effective. But, you know, people with autism need a range of strategies, as perhaps I do. I need to sometimes read the manual or read the instructions. I can't believe, or I find it hard to credit the fact that it was over 30 years ago when Lorna Wing and Judy Gould first pointed out that people with autism have different levels of sociability. Sociability, of course, is not the same as social understanding, it's not the same as social skills. It's how sociable we are or want to be. And that's very variable. And you may remember that they divided it up into different categories. So a withdrawn category, solitary, and a passive, so someone will respond but they don't initiate contact, and that wonderful category of active but odd, and then finally people are just a bit eccentric and perhaps oversensitive. Now, this translation is not evidence-based, but it's what I interpret and my experience interprets of how we should react differently to those categories. Recognising that people change categories as they get older, as they get subject to teaching, but also that they may change because they're in a depression. Someone may be active but odd, right up to their teens, then get depressed and go right back to being withdrawn. So we have to look at how the person is individually at that time. And for me, if someone's withdrawn, then they need a very directive approach. You need to notice that you're trying to interact. You need to draw them out, so you need a very one-to-one directive approach. At the same time, they also need a desensitisation program. They need to learn to be comfortable with other people around them again. So we have to have both things going together. When they're passive, then they're the group that we use their interests. But we not only must use their interests to motivate them, we have to give them structure so that they know how to do it. Not enough just to get them to want to do it, we also have to show them how. So the two things again. The active but odd group, now they're the group that need the rules, the social rules, and they also, of course, need experience, perhaps with a buddy to point things out in their context. And then that eccentric group may just need the buddy. They may just be there. A range of cognitive approaches now, I'm very pleased to say, many years ago when I started, but I was always very lazy and didn't really spell it out in enough detail. Things like Heather Mackenzie's book give great details about how we might go about being cognitive. And a new tool on the market is Tommy Mackay and Anne Gregg's homunculi program, Little Men in the Head. It's very practical. It gets children to have a head. The head comes in the pack with little men in it, and there's a screen. They learn to manipulate the men and therefore manipulate their actions and their behaviour through manipulating the men. So it's a very concrete, but nevertheless concrete. There's something about Gary Mes's important distinction about evidence-based practice. We talk about evidence-based practice, but sadly people often still refer to really education evidence-supported treatment. And the difference is this: if you're a scientist and you want to find out what method might work overall, or if you're somebody selling a method, or maybe even if you're an administrator, an organisation or a social services, a big body, then you may want to know where you should put your money. So it has a role to find out which treatment, which might be medication, but it might also be a particular methodology.